Okay, this is called, as you know, the philosophy of the cosmic dance. And the whole object of the exercise is partly so you can process and assimilate the training which you're doing at the moment. Because as you know, in your classes you're not allowed to say anything. So this is your chance to say things and ask questions. And I'll start off by giving you the sort of background history of this house and the society and the traditions which lie behind it. And then when I've done that, I'll go into the teaching which sort of lies behind the Mevlevi dervish tradition and all mystical traditions. So I'll approach it in quite a sort of general way, because nearly all of you come from different backgrounds and different traditions, and lots of you have your own teachers and schools and different methods you practice. So none of this will conflict with that. I'll try and relate it to your particular area, and at the same time I'll give you a background to the Mevlevi, and I'll explain the principles that lie behind it, and then it will lead up to explaining the symbolism of the ceremony in a few weeks' time. But before I can do that, I have to sort of give you the background philosophy that lies behind all mystical traditions, and then it becomes much clearer when I go into the symbolism of the ceremony which you're nearly all learning to turn in. And watching it tonight, it's actually the first time I've seen you all as a class, and you're all doing really fantastically. It's amazing. So, thank you very much. And anytime you want to ask a question, just stop me and ask it, because I adore answering questions. It's sort of, how much I say is how much you sort of draw out of me. So if you find things that interest you, question me about it, and particularly around the history. And when I tell the history, all different groups and societies have their own mythology, and mythologies often get exaggerated by students. So stories are just stories. They don't get too bogged down in any of the stories I tell you about the history, because it's easy for things to become mythologized. So any group you belong to will have a sort of interesting story, and that's all it is, it's a story. But it just puts you in the picture of the background and how we come to have dervish turning here and why we have it. So I'll start around about the year 1900, and this society was started, the work in this house was started by a Russian philosopher and mathematician called P.D. Uspensky. And back at about the turn of the 20th century, so around about 1900 up till the First World War, he was very interested in the study of consciousness. And by the word consciousness, he meant the awareness we have behind our thoughts and our feelings and our desires. So when you're thinking and when you're feeling, there's something behind that which is aware that you're thinking and you're feeling, and that he used the term consciousness. And so he was interested in ways of accessing that unchanging sense of I am that lies behind your psyche. And he wrote quite an intelligent book on it called Tertium Organum. And then he went off to India around about 1913, 1912, trying to find methods for accessing that deeper sense of I am, practical methods. But then he got called back because the First World War broke out, and he was mobilized and had to go back to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And while he was there, he met an enigmatic Greek teacher called George Gurdjieff, And for a while, during the sort of tumultuous times of the Russian Revolution and the First World War, he studied in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and later down in Constantinople, and as it was then, and other places with Gurdjieff and his school. And as time went on, their paths diverged, and Gurdjieff had quite a it was quite a strict system, and it was quite controlling, and I think Uspensky realised that he had no doubts about the teaching Gurdjieff was teaching, but he had doubts about Gurdjieff as a teacher. So their paths diverged, and Gurdjieff had been out in the East again at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, going to different schools and collecting knowledge, and also collecting lots of different sacred dances, which we also still practice here. So Mr. Uspensky, early 1920s, he came to London, and eventually he completely set up on his own, and he started gathering people around him, and at a certain point they acquired this house here, they used to rent it, because at one time the Russian Ballet had it, and another time the Royal Ballet had it, and Uspensky used this as his London headquarters. And they had another big country house down in Surrey, near Virginia Water, at a place called Lyne. And so, sort of in the week time, people were all here coming to Uspensky's meetings, and then at weekends they'd often go down and work on the farm and do practical methods and the sacred dances. And Uspensky had carried on developing the teaching that he'd learnt from Gurdjieff, and he'd developed his own ideas as well, which he'd written about earlier in his books. And towards the end of his life, about 1947, it was like he'd gone right beyond what he'd learnt from Gurdjieff, and he did 3 final big meetings here in that top studio where you've all just been turning in. And he said to 2 of his closest followers, gather 300 people together. And they gathered the 300 people up there, and Mr. Uspensky was up on that platform, which is still at the end of the room. And he said that he abandoned the system, the Gurdjieff system, and the system he'd been teaching up till that point. And that threw everyone into sort of confusion, because people get very used to particular metaphors and particular ways of seeing things. So there was a big confusion at that point. But privately he had prepared particularly one of his pupils, who was a man called Dr. Francis Rolls, to go off and find what he'd been looking for originally in the first place before he met Gurdjieff. And he also, which is amazingly interesting, I only just learnt about this just over a year ago, after he'd abandoned the teaching, he wrote out very simply what he meant, and then that was put in a sealed envelope which was not to be opened till 60 years later, which was 2007. And someone sent me what he'd written earlier last year, and it was absolutely amazing. He'd completely turned the thing the other way around. But after he died in 1947, his main pupil was a doctor called Dr. Francis Rolls, and that's him there, and he was my teacher, and he was my sheikh, so that's him wearing the Mevlevi Sikke. And at the time he was the only Christian who had been granted the wearing of a destur, which is the green ribbons of a Mevlevi shape, but I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. So during the 1950s, Dr. Rolls carried on teaching what he'd learnt from Uspensky, and Uspensky was convinced that there was some sort of system or teaching which lay behind the different schools of philosophy. And Uspensky had asked him to go off and find a method which could be used in everyday life. And the sort of cornerstone of Gurdjieff and Uspensky's teaching had been what was known as self-remembering. And Uspensky tried to explain it, but none of his pupils really quite grasped what he was on about. But basically, the idea of self-remembering is just recalling that deeper sense of self, or I am, which lies behind your changing psyche. So when you're 5 years old, there's something looking out through your eyes which is exactly the same as when you're 60 years old. It doesn't change one bit. What changes is the bit that it looks out through. So physical body is changing every day, and your psyche is changing all the time. So what you call I, so at one point you say I am a schoolboy, then later on you say I am a grown-up, or I am an artist, and that sense of I am is changing all the time. It keeps changing, but behind that is this completely unchanging sense of self. So that was what Mr. Uspensky was trying to get people to understand, but he thought there must be good practical methods for accessing that. And I think nowadays, in current terminology, it has names like mindfulness or presence. So it's accessing that deeper sense of self. So Dr. Rolls' job in the 1950s, Colet, was to go off and find any teacher who came along who had a really authentic, valid method, and to see if it was the one Mr. Uspensky had been looking for. And it was about early 1961, after they'd had many different experiments with different people, which had all gone a bit pear-shaped. 1961, the then little-known Maharishi Mahesh Yogi came along, who later went on to teach the Beatles how to meditate in about 1965-66. So he used to come along here, and again, like with Gurdjieff, Dr. Rolls realised that he wasn't the man Uspensky had told him to look for. So he had a method which Dr. Rolls felt took you right to the pure consciousness. And then at a certain point, Dr. Rolls went out to study with the Maharishi in Rishikesh. And one day the Maharishi said that his teacher was coming along to visit them. And in India, years and years ago, around about somewhere between the 6th and the 9th century, the Indian Vedic tradition, which was the tradition which came down through the Indian scriptures known as the Vedas, had become very top-heavy. So it's like you had a priestly caste, and they were all busy meditating and transcending. And then you had everyone who was sort of out in the world. So it was like there was a division between what you might call transcendence and immanence. And so it's like the Vedic tradition had become very top-heavy. And around about between the 6th and the 9th century AD, a great teacher arose called Shankara. And Shankara is just another name for god Shiva, and there's Shiva there. And Shankara lived a very short time. He lived about 30 years, and he established what was known as the Advaita tradition. And Advaita translates roughly as not two, so it really means non-dualism. Everything is one. And also around about that time was also when what is known as Tantra arose. And both Advaita and Tantra are quite similar, because it's no longer reality is just transcendent somewhere high up there. Reality is both transcendent up there and it's fully present right here. So it's like samsara and nirvana are one. There's not pure consciousness over there and physical world here. Both of them are one. So in living your life fully and dancing your dance, it's exactly the same thing as going into deep meditation and transcending it. So you live both fully, you both transcend, and you fully play your part in the great drama of life. So that's going back to Shankara, and he set up 4 seats of learning. So you had a Shankaracharya, which means Shankara teacher, north, south, east and west, and they carried on down the centuries, a bit like the Archbishop of Canterbury or something. It's sort of a tradition that goes on. And Dr. Rolls made contact with the northern Shankaracharya, and for the next 20 years Dr. Rolls used to go over and have audiences with him, and he gradually unfolded the non-dual Advaita teaching to him. And what I sort of realised was that Uspensky had realised that what he'd been teaching was almost completely back to front and upside down, and Uspensky realised that, and he expresses it in the letter he wrote to be opened 60 years later. And he wanted Dr. Rolls to go back and find the source of what he'd been teaching, so it could be turned the right way round. And with the teaching came a method of meditation for people living busy Western lives. So if you already have a method of meditation, then that's perfect and that's absolutely the right one for you. If you don't have a method and you want one, then one is available here if you want it. And then during the 1920s, Mr. Uspensky had been very interested in the Mevlevi dervish tradition in Turkey, and he'd gone and had talks with some of the sheikhs in Istanbul mostly, and in Konya, and he recognised that the whirling dervish ceremony, when he watched it, was another method for accessing this deeper sense of self. So when you access, you notice what's looking out through your eyes. It's like it's a great sort of fathomless stillness or a great emptiness, and with it comes a great happiness. So it's like it emanates this great unconditional happiness, and that was what Dr. Rolls was looking for, more methods which would suit different people to access that. And 1963, one of the Colet House members had a Turkish boy who was working on a farm she had down in Surrey, and the Turkish boy had an uncle who was a Mevlevi dervish in Turkey. And just to give you again more background, the Mevlevi dervishes, as you know, were founded by Jalaluddin Rumi back in the 13th century, around about sort of 1270 something. And he had spontaneously gone into the whirling dance, but I'll tell you more about that later. And his immediate family had then formalised it into the ceremony that you're now learning at the moment. So it had gone on all the way down through sort of 700 years or more as an unbroken tradition. And then, well, even in Turkey, most towns had what was known as a Mevlevi Tekke, which was the place where the dervishes went and assembled and learnt to turn and did the Makabale. And then in 1925, after the First World War, the Ottoman Empire had completely collapsed because Turkey was defeated. And Kemal Ataturk, who had been, I think, a colonel in the Turkish army, became the ruler of Turkey. And he wanted to westernize and modernize Turkey. He thought it had become too much stuck in the past and too feudal. And he wanted to make it into a modern Western nation. And in 1925 he brought in a law which banned all dervish orders. They were all abolished, all fortune tellers, which he linked in with anything which he regarded as superstitious was banned. So all the dervish tekes, all these thousands of whirling dervishes, were suddenly forbidden to turn, and you could go to prison if you were caught turning or practicing any of the banned activities. So the poor Mevlevi at that point all had to they had to go underground, and all they could do was sort of draw their curtains and turn in their front rooms on their carpets, but no longer were you allowed to meet in a teke and have the makabale. And then late 1950s it started to be allowed as a tourist attraction in Konya, particularly in December when they celebrate the death of Rumi. And it was at one of those times that the Turkish boy invited 3 Colet House members over to witness the ceremony, and they went and saw the makabale taking place in Konya. And the sheikh who stands on the red carpet in the ceremony was a sheikh called Resui Beykara, and that's him there. I knew him in the 1970s and 80s. And his grandfather was a Mevlevi sheikh, and he was one of the people that Mr. Uspensky had met and talked to in his travels in the 1920s. And when you're on the skin, I know from experience, I often look at the audience and you can see exactly who's engaged and who's fast asleep. You can see some people that have a sort of light in their eyes, and other people are sort of sitting like this and sort of definitely not engaged with it. So Mr. Resui spotted these 3 people from Colet in the audience around about 1961 or 2, and they went up and talked to him afterwards, and they said, would it be possible for him to come over to London and teach people to turn in London. And Mr. Resui went to his sheikh, which is this man here, and he was called Munir Çelebi, and he was considered a very great sheikh. He lived in a place called Afyon in Turkey, where he was known as Munir Çelebi of Afyon. And a Çelebi in Turkey is a direct descendant of Rumi, so it's someone from Rumi's actual family. And Munir Çelebi went away and prayed to Mevlana, as Rumi is known as, and he came back with the answer of, yes, you must go to London and teach for turning. So in 1963, Mr. Resui was a civil servant, and he had 4 weeks annual holiday, and he came over in his 4 weeks, and he taught 60 people to turn in 4 weeks in here. And by the time he went back, the makabale was up and running, and he made Dr. Earls the sheikh, because he said Dr. Earls had a light in his eyes, so he became the sheikh. And then people had to learn all the different prayers, and they had to make all the robes. Mr. Resui brought 1 set of robes over, and there was a big sort of sewing team here, and everyone got to work, and by the end of the 4 weeks everyone had robes, and the prayers had been learnt, and the tradition was up and running. And he was very radical for his time, because over in Turkey up till then only men were allowed to turn, and he came over here and taught both men and women. And even now, to this day in Turkey, men and women aren't allowed to turn together. They have their own separate, segregated ceremonies. So when he went back to Turkey, I think he probably got into trouble with some of the hardliners for his radicalness. So in our tradition here, and it's carried on ever since then, so we've had 53 years here now, we always have men and women turning together, and we can have women can be the sheikh as much as a man can. And in fact we still have this man's Munia Chelebi's daughter is very old now, she's well on in her 90s, but she is still alive, and she's a descendant of Rumi, and she's called Gulsum Chelebi, and she's technically our sheikh at the moment in Turkey. And Dr. Rolls was sheikh up until his death in 1982, and then he handed over to a Norwegian man called Willem Koren. And Willem is still alive, but he's 96, isn't he? And he's probably in the last month of his life at the moment, and he might even in an ambulance come to your lesson in 2 weeks' time. There's a possibility he might come and watch it just as his end of life treat is being worked on at the moment. And then Willem handed over to me about, I can't remember how many years ago it was now, 7, something like that. Okay, so it's 7 or 8 years, something like that. So anyway, so 1960s, 1970s, this house had become like a meeting place of different traditions. So you had what Dr. Rolls had carried on from the Uspensky teaching, and it wasn't all of it, a lot of it he dropped, but there were bits he thought were very valuable, and that was sort of the Western mystical tradition, which he reckoned went back to the Neoplatonists probably. So you had Neoplatonism, Western mystical tradition, and then you had the Advaita tradition from India coming in, and then you had the Mevlevi dervish tradition. So it was like a meeting point of different non-dual traditions. And back in Uspensky's day, it was all very secretive, and it was what was known as an esoteric school, so it was very sort of regimented. And especially in the sort of late 40s, people were all demobbing from the Second World War, and they were all a bit wild. So I think they had to be sort of disciplined quite a lot. So it was a bit fearsome. But under Dr. Rolls' sort of reign, it all became much looser and much more friendly. And Dr. Rolls died in 1982, and just before he died, in his last year, he did like what Uspensky had done. He started seeing everything completely differently, and he said that our role as a school was over, and he wanted this house to be what he called a cell of self-knowledge, no longer the image of an esoteric school, but a place that people can come to for rest and refreshment, particularly the young, for whom life is very difficult today. And then the day before he died, just the night before, he said, everything I had to do has now been done. And he said, we've had everything upside down and back to front. There's only one consciousness. Everything is that consciousness. That is what we have to feel and know. And that for me was like he'd suddenly pointed where he wanted this society to go. He didn't want it to be a secretive esoteric school. He wanted it to be open and freely available for everyone. and he wanted people to be able to come along and dip into those parts of it which appealed to them. So you've got now got quite a range of different activities. So you've got things like the Advaita tradition, traditional Advaita, modern Advaita, meditation from the Advaita tradition. You've got part of what Uspensky wanted continued. You've got the sacred dances known as the movements, which Gurdjieff collected out on his travels in Tibet and Central Asia and Russia and other places, practiced on a Monday. And you've got the whole Mevlevi dervish tradition. And as well as the ceremony, you've got the music, which they're practicing at the moment. And you've got the sort of study, for those who want it, of Rumi's Masnavi and other writings. So Dr. Earls died in 82, and it sort of moved on after that. It didn't immediately find its feet, because always when a great teacher dies, you get people all sort of going off in different directions, and some people wanting it to go back to how it was in Mr. Uspensky's day, and other people wanting it to be pure Advaita. But there was quite a lot of divergence. For me personally, 82 and the next few years were the most exciting bit, because it was like Dr. Earls had given us these pointers as to how he wanted it, and he'd seen something in his last year. And in my talks with him, I was aware that he'd seen something, but he was really frustrated because people weren't seeing what he'd seen, and he kept trying to tell them, and they would all try and take it back into how it used to be. So my particular interest became trying to see what Dr. Earls had seen in that last year and what his revelation was, particularly in relation to we've had everything upside down and back to front. So what did he mean by turning it around? Because that was exactly what Mr. Uspensky had also done at the end of his life. So since then, so that's he died 34 years ago now. So we've carried on, and I really feel now, just in this last year or two, it's suddenly, almost this year, it suddenly has the possibility to become what it's meant to be. It's very easy if you get a powerful person trying to control it and push it in this direction or that direction. But if you observe it closely, you'll see there's a direction it wants to go in. So it's very important to let it become what it wants to be. And it's very important to listen to younger people as well and not try and control it. It suffered from older people, I think, in the past trying to push it in one direction or another. But you just have to let it move very carefully in the way it wants to go. And then what happens, and we've noticed that, is people appear suddenly from nowhere, from the great unmanifest, and you get people who suddenly appear who have got a particular role to play in relation to its development. And that's exactly where we are at the moment. And the actual dervish part of it has been blossoming for the last few years. A lot of the rest of it has been gradually sort of running down and fading out. But I do feel now there's a sort of chance, it's like it has its moment, and I think its moment's yet to come. So there's a potted history for you. Have you got any questions about the potted history?
Why 60 years?
I don't know why he did that. I think he wrote out these instructions. If you're interested, I'll read them to you later on in the talk. But I think he realised that knowledge had to move on. It's like knowledge is reformulated each generation. I think Max Planck said knowledge progresses funeral by funeral, which is like people become very fixed in their ideas and their models of reality, and it's very difficult to budge someone from a model of reality if they're well into it. So it's almost like knowledge has to move on, and people who hold a very fixed view and hold knowledge in place at a certain level die eventually, because everyone dies. So that's what Max Planck meant by knowledge progresses funeral by funeral. So I think Ouspensky knew that it wasn't its moment, but it would be later on. That's my understanding. I might be wrong. Don't believe anything I say. Another thing. Any more?
Has the teaching of the turning changed over the 50 odd years that it's been?
Mr. Ezui wanted us to keep it exactly, to teach it exactly as it had always been taught. So the actual things like turning on the board and the nail and all the details are exactly as he taught it. And it's strict and formal, but it's much more relaxed and loving, I think, around it. When I first learnt it 40 years ago this year, it was quite scary. And the Sheikh and the other sort of Samas and Bashes were very sort of far away and remote. And I think it was, if you turned in a macabre, you still accessed the great stillness and the love and happiness that goes with it. But it was grimmer. It was also done as a 4-week crash course at about 6:30 every morning, 6 days a week for 5 weeks. And when Helen became the teacher, Helen changed that after a couple of years working like that. We found it was too much of a crash course. It took people too quickly. So Helen changed it to lessons sort of weekly or twice a week in the evening. And you find that with a whole week between your classes, your body learns things in your sleep at night when you're not actively doing it. So you can have an absolutely disastrous lesson one week and you think, I'm never going to get this, and you go away crying. Then you come back the next week and something's completely changed. And having the gap between the lessons gives it the opportunity for that to happen. And all of you will have a ghastly lesson. More than one, I can guarantee it. But you're also going to have the most profoundly blissful lessons as well. And just when you think you're never going to get it, then that's the point at which something switches and something changes. So it's very difficult to sort of anticipate it. But in a way, as Helen says, you have to surrender to the process. Because learning to turn really is about surrender and letting go. And the other thing that happens in the process, as you've observed, during our lives, from sort of childhood onwards, we try and protect ourselves from suffering. And to do that, we often put up walls around us so we don't get hurt anymore. You have a big hurt, and then you try and protect yourself from more hurt. And that eventually sort of builds a hardened layer around you. And in the turning process, I don't know how it happens, but it does. It seems to dissolve those walls and those layers. And then the thing which you've hidden in there will suddenly pop up to the surface. So after some classes you might find yourself in tears and grieving, or another class anger about something might come up. And all of those things, you just let them come up. You don't try and push it down again or block it. It's like a cooking pot, and it bubbles up to the surface. And Helen, as a teacher, keeps an eye on you and sees what's the right thing to do for each individual student at given moments. Mr. Esby sometimes used to chase people around the room with a stick, but we don't do that anymore. So I think also, the sort of climate's moved on as well, because back then in the early 60s it was more fierce, and nowadays you have health and safety and things, and so it's only changed. It's changed to a degree because the climate's changed.
In Turkey, we had a Turkish boy here, didn't we, a few years ago? And in Turkey, your training is 3 years. And in 3 years, he was only allowed to miss 3 lessons. Otherwise, they just threw you off the training. So you get 3 lessons you can miss in 4 months. And he only missed 1 lesson in 3 years. And that was it. He went every week. And it's because he couldn't get across the other side of Istanbul in the snow in winter. And it's a pretty big city, so that's why he missed 1 lesson. And out of all of his group, I think only 3 of them made it to the end. So most people don't drop out in the middle of the training. Most people, despite how hard it is, you will get to the end, but by the end you'll be seriously wondering, how soon you can run away. And I thought exactly the same thing myself when I was in that cooking pot. When is it gonna end? And you can leave at the end of your training if you want. But in a sense, the end is another beginning, because you don't have me saying you can't miss more than 3 lessons. Something inside you is then going to have to get you here. So it's how much discipline you have inside yourself to carry on. Because in my experience of carrying on it goes deeper as the years go by. It's a very deep, profound practice, and it gets richer. But the process, especially this bit is really difficult.
You know that you give like a week in between the lessons to give time for the body to settle itself. I'm just wondering if that process that you talked about, right, immediately after a lesson something comes up, if you perceive that to continue during the week, there's any unravelling during the week as well, or is it just a physical setting?
It can happen during the week as well. It's so different with different people. My experience of my own training was, I just remember having masses of energy and being very happy. But with it's because I was quite young and I hadn't had that many life traumas at that point. But yeah, it can things coming up, it can continue during the week. Or alternately, you might find you're blissfully happy during the week. Something happens, you're walking along and it's suddenly like the curtains part and something inside you just wells up, which is full of happiness. So it will vary. But just, if grief, for instance, comes up or sadness, just let it bubble up. So if you want to cry or whatever, do that. And again, this meeting here is the processing place. So anything that needs processing, process it. Or any time you want to speak to either me or Helen privately, just do that.
Do you know the name of that Turkish boy whose uncle was that sheikh?
I don't know the name of him. I should have asked, because the lady's dead now, whose farm it was. And I don't even know the name of the uncle. It is amazing the way these things sort of fit together. The way I describe life, my experience of living life is I call it a cosmic jigsaw puzzle. Because when you're actually living bits of it, it all seems sort of separate and disjointed. But when you look back at it, the whole thing sort of slots together like one immaculate jigsaw. And you think, aha. And people who sort of appear in your life, so often sort of 40 years ago, suddenly come back to play a particular role years later. So it's like the whole of life is this immaculately produced movie, and you're just witnessing it unfold. We don't like witnessing it, so we want to jump in and interfere with it. But most of the time you can just sit back and watch this amazing unfolding going on.
Is there a reason why we turn in one direction, and do other traditions turn in the other?
In the Gurdjieff movements, we used to turn in the other direction. They'd have a thing called movements turning. With Mevlevi, it's always been anti-clockwise, which I think is the way the planets turn. And you're turning into your heart. So it's sort of, having turned it both ways, I prefer the Mevlevi way of turning into your heart. And this movement you were learning today is the most profound, my favourite bit of the whole thing, because it's like a flower opening, and your arms drop down, and then they sort of join down there, and then they go up like that, and they go up through past either side of your face, and then they go up like that. And this one being high is important because it helps you with your pillar. If one or two of you were opening too soon, one or two of you were sort of going like that, you need to drop it right down and go up past your head and right up like a flower, so the sort of petals are like the petals are opening. So as you do it, visualize yourself as something like a tulip or something opening up, and it really helps your pillar, because then in the macabre, when you turn out past the skin, it's my favourite bit. You just start turning and your skirt comes out, and then you just sort of open up like a flower opening. It's amazing.
I wanted to ask about the fact that you receive in your right hand and you give in your left. I've heard in other traditions that actually you receive in the left and then you
Yeah.
give in the right.
Yeah. You comment on that.
We're just doing what we were taught.
It's sort of like, what it symbolises, I can't say why it's right or left. I just don't think with my images of Buddha in his earth touching posture, I think he's this way around, so that hand is upwards and the right hand is down. When I look at images of Buddha like that, I've always thought, well, it's like the dervish image but back to front. And with the dervish image, it's just the image of being a transparent vehicle for consciousness. So that's open, that's receiving. And then it's like it goes down through the heart, which needs to be a clear, transparent heart, and then out. So it's like a symbol. Rumi uses the symbol of the ney flute, and the ney has no life except when it's blown into by the breath of God. So in the non-dual traditions, particularly Advaita, they use the metaphor of not being the doer, and it's like you are a vehicle for consciousness. You're not the creator of consciousness. Consciousness passes through you as a vehicle, a bit like the way a radio wave passes through a radio and produces sound. So it's like a symbol of you being the vehicle for consciousness. And when you access the great stillness, and everyone is the great stillness already, you don't even have to access it, it's looking out through your eyes. But when you know that, it's like it flows through you, so you no longer feel like you're generating things. When I do a painting, I design all day long, and when I do a design, when I've done it, I sort of look at it and think, where did that come from? And you sort of say, well done, God, because it's like you're not doing anything. It's like everything passes through you. And I think any creative artist or performer or musician knows that feeling of it. You're just a vehicle. So, but why it's right and left, I'm not fully sure.
Is there a difference between the arms being very high or being flat? Because I've seen videos of turners who turn and their arms are almost horizontal.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if there's
Yeah, I can explain that. The ideal position, as taught, is I probably can't get to him as my arms are a bit crooked, but it's sort of roughly that. But all of you, unless you're a super person, will become tired. And your arms, when you're tired, they go down. In the macabre, you start off like that as you bow out. And then if there's space, if there aren't too many turners around you, and you get tired, your arms can come down near to horizontal. And then when you lot come out, there's going to be a hell of a lot of turners out there. Will probably be 40 plus in the room. And then when you're very tight, you turn slowly with your arms right up there. If not, you clobber the person next to you. And that's brilliant because it gives you a whole new dimension to the attention you need in the ceremony. But then it's a bit like a concertina, like you get in a traffic jam on a motorway. You're in a big traffic jam and suddenly it opens up and you think, great, I'm out of the jam. And you roar away. Then you get in another concertina. And it's like that in the macabre. At times you'll be squashed and you'll turn slowly with your arms very high. And then it will open up. Oh, great, I can have a good whirl. And your arms can come down a bit. And then later on you'll need to put them up again. So it will progress on like that. One of the reasons why Mr. Rezui wanted us to look after it was because in Turkey you have a lot of now professional dervishes out there who know nothing about the teaching but just do it as a profession so they can turn in restaurants and other things. And if you look at most of the arm postures of those dervishes, they mostly sort of turn like that. And Mr. Rezui and others were sad because the original posture was being lost. So you won't all get the exact posture, but you'll get the best you can get because all of us are physiologically very different, and some people can get an amazing immaculate posture, but others will do the best you can, and that's absolutely fine. But don't worry if you don't get a perfect posture, because physiologically we can't all get a perfect posture, but we do our best.
Does the posture and movement not mimic an invisible movement and flow of energy that's inherent in all bodies and physicality?
That's a Helen question.
I've studied Chinese medicine, and the other thing that I think that happens is you have a breath in your spine. You know, from the Hindu tradition, it's prana, and you're moving energy through this. So the spine also has its own breath. The breath of the spine is slower than the breath of the lungs. So when you move the breath of the spine, and you will do that in turning, you are going to move the energy up, like so. You could say, I mean, Mr. Rizui never taught this, but in my own experience as a body worker, you're going to shift the energy through the chakra system quite very strongly. You are also, in doing this, in Chinese medicine, you're actually opening the heart meridian, because the heart meridian runs from the little finger. So you're opening that as well. So you're working this on a very, your body in a very physical level, but you're also going to open the meridians or the nadis, whichever you relate to. So that's going to happen in those postures. So you are working in on the physical form, and you are working the subtle body. And in doing that, you are going to move internal energies, which will create physical and emotional release. So don't, and I've seen you're all sweating away up there, and stuff is going on, and that's what I would call, it's an alchemical process. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Speaking of sweating, what's going on there? Because there's been a few times there's like a massive amount of energy that comes up, get very hot.
Yeah, you will.
Just from time to time, it's going hot flush.
Cooking.
It's aerobic exercise as it is, so it's going to
It's
reach.
not continuous heat actually. It's kind of like little
Yeah.
burst of flame.
Releases.
Yeah.
But when we get to the end, you know, when you often see turners and you go down in turning practice, some of you stay in turn, and a lot of turners, when we kiss the floor at the end, when we start to do that, you will realise how fast your heart is beating. This is seriously aerobic exercise. It's like going out for a run. And your underclothes, under the robes that you'll be wearing, will be soaking wet.
That's
So
why we need to know your medical history.
you will be soaking
You
wet.
have to know you're fit enough.
Yeah.
I have one more question. It relates to the skirt. Is there a spiritual significance to the skirt?
There is, but I'll tell you it later. 'Cause when I do the whole thing, I'll do all the symbolism of the different robes you put on. But it's a very nice symbolism.
Can I just ask about the direction of the head? Because I'm really working on the left, keeping my head to the left, and I find I'm okay if I'm not looking directly at my elbow. The minute I start really looking at my elbow, I just get incredibly dizzy, and I keep on going in and out and trying to do it. Is it necessary to look directly into
No.
the elbow? Okay.
In actual fact, when you're here, when we were doing it today, so you just see, and you're like that. I don't. When I learnt to turn, because my Willem, who was shaking, was always doing this to me, because my head, it was always like my head couldn't go left. And in actual fact, I think I painted a blue stripe on my thumbnail. This is after vomiting, I can tell you. Just so I could train my eyes to look in that direction. But you don't really, just so you know, you don't really have to kind of like eyeball your, because in actual fact, when we start moving around the room, your peripheral vision gets larger, because you will always know where you will learn to know where you are in space. And that's another skill you learn. But also, it's in my experience is why I sometimes do that for some people. Because again, it goes back to Mark's question of internal meridians and nadis that travel through the arms into the heart and the lungs, and you're also opening the chest. But also, it's almost like God's taking you on a dance and He's leading you. Because remember, this is part of the surrender process. It's something has brought you here or guided you here, and you don't get abandoned. It's almost like sometimes when I'm turning a bit, it's like, well, God's just leading me round. I'm never left on my own in this process, and that helps keep all this open and up. Because at the end, like most when you first start, you're like, oh, I've really got to try and do this, okay? And in the end, it's like, okay, you are not doing it at the end of the day. This is part of what he's saying. It's like, you are not doing it. It is, you are being done. You are being turned. You are being danced.
I was referring also as the internal energy flow, but it's an external energy flow. It's a little bit relating to, or pertaining to, what's a term, sacred geometry. So there's a geometric construct, an invisible organisation to the force of everything in the universe. And so I guess it was my impression that the movements of turning followed it, and certainly harmonised with it.
It's a bit like the shape is the sun and where the planets that move around him. So, as a universal.
That's a good explanation.
Yeah, but also on a personal level. I have a sketch of it. Helps. Good.
Have you had situations where... Oh, I'm sorry.
It's a nice drawing.
Yeah. Yeah, they are.
Very nice. Let's check on the drawing.
Like the dervishes adore.
Very nice drawing.
Yes, these days they call it a toroid field.
You ought to scan them and put them on Turners on Facebook. Thank you.
But, I mean, the idea and the principle of the toroid field is said to be the whole energy organisation behind everything, and it's very, very similar. So I guess it relates to what you say, as in you're not really doing it, it's just there anyway. Normally we're not really abiding to that movement.
Margaret?
I was just curious about surrender and have you ever witnessed someone being completely carried away to the point where they get into a bliss state and they're not with the group? I mean, this is obviously a community, and I understand you need to know the geography of the room and how people are turning and have that peripheral vision be present. But have you ever actually experienced anyone in a private makabale, particularly in a private makabale? Because I would imagine it's less present in a public one, where somebody has just literally gone off.
Yeah. What its turning's all about is it's definitely not about trance. It's you become so present when you're turning. It's like you know exactly where you are, and you know where everyone else in the room is. So it's like expanded awareness, very, very attentive. Now and again with new turners, it sometimes happens you get someone starting to want to modify it into something different, and not understanding that total stillness and total awareness, they try and turn it into a trance dance, and then you see they start to lose their position, they start to lose the love of their fellow turners, and they go into a frenzy and start hitting people. So at that point you have to stop them, and then you have to even give them some extra lessons and get them to practice more so they get that still centre and the pillar and the still turn. So it does happen now and again, but it's like a deviation. Now and again you get someone we teach who thinks they know they can do it much better, and then they decide it's trance dance and they go off and try and teach it as a trance dance, which it's not. So it's just one of those things that now and again someone tries to do it, but it's not what we're about. What the Mevlevi turn's about is accessing the great stillness, which is your own true nature and is the true nature of the whole universe, rather than it being just a free-form whirling. So it does happen, but part of why we have turning practices is to remind people of what the turn involves and what it's about.
And you can feel blissfully happy in it and afterwards.
The after effect of it, in my experience, is a profound stillness. It's like, I once described it as a roaring stillness. It's so powerful, it's like it's this amazing stillness, and with it comes this amazing happiness. It's like it's an unconditional happiness. And I remember turning once it was the day after the worst day of my whole life and I felt so miserable before, but after Maccabi I was just so happy. I knew I was having a terrible time, but it was all going on over there somewhere. And so in accessing your true nature, which is stillness, you get this unconditional happiness, and the stillness and the happiness gradually permeates through your life. And then once you've got that, you don't have to go on waffling about holy things. You just go off and dance your dance in life. And when you dance your dance, then you inspire other people to dance their dance. So in the end, it's not even a journey, it's a dance. Journeys have a sort of beginning and an end. This is like life is this amazing dance. And the dance is for the sake of the dance. It's not for the sake of getting somewhere, it's for the sake of dancing. To make it a good dance. And make sure you enjoy it. I think it's probably supper time-ish. I'm going to do another one of these on Tuesday after your classes, and then I'll do it every Tuesday up till Christmas at least. If you want more after that, it will probably be up to you to decide. You may, when we put more and more of the ceremony in, time gets shorter, but I'll cover you the sort of basics up to Christmas, and I'll make sure you get the symbolism of the ceremony. And next, on Tuesday, I'll start on the teaching which lies behind it all. That was sort of an introduction to the history. Thank you very much.
Thank you.